Keys to the Shop, episode 321, Marketing and Moral Injury with Josh Tarlo. Well, hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DeFurio. I'm your host for the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me, and I would really love it if you would subscribe to Keys to the Shop. That way you can always be updated with new episodes as they come out. It also really helps the show get found by more wonderful people like yourself. So just hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts, and also share these episodes where you can. Let people know about Keys to the Shop, whether that's your team, a friend, or whoever, share Keys to the Shop. That'd be really awesome. Now, Keys to the Shop is nominated for an award, actually. We're in the finals of the Sprudgies, the 13th annual Sprudgies happening this year. Coffee podcast is one of the categories amongst things like in the most notable roaster, best coffee writing, those kind of categories. There is the best coffee podcast category, and Keys to the Shop is one of many of the great coffee podcasts out there. I would really appreciate it if you would vote for Keys to the Shop. Just visit sprudge.com/vote, and you will be able to do so. I really appreciate those of you who nominated Keys to the Shop for this award. And of course, doing this show is kind of its own reward. But thank you, everybody. And, Keys to the Shop, on top of doing this podcast, also offers consulting and coaching, where I get to work with you directly to help you improve your operations or to help you get your coffee business started on the right foot. You can avoid needless mistakes, build foundations that will last you a long time in the future. Keys to the Shop Consulting can do this with you either remotely or on site. And if you want to set up a free exploratory call where we can decide if working with Keys to the Shop Consulting is right for you, just email me, chris@keystotheshop.com. It would be great to hear about what's going on in your world. And again, if Keys to the Shop Consulting can help you out. So that email again for Keys to the Shop Consulting, chris@keystotheshop.com. Now, today's episode of Keys to the Shop is brought to you by the Ground Control Cyclops Brewer. So coffee brewing, batch brewing, is one of those things where, for a while, we were just like, pour overs, they're the best. And then we were like, you know what? Batch brew can, if you really finesse it, you can make amazing batch brew. And it was so true. But now there is something that is changing the game for batch brew coffee, leveling it up in ways that no amount of hacking existing brewers could ever do. And it is the Ground Control Cyclops Brewer. The SCA award-winning technology allows you to extract a range of flavors from your coffee that previously you could not even experience, and do so in such a repeatable and precise way. It is truly amazing. It not only makes amazing batch brew coffee, but also makes tea, batch iced lattes, batch cold brew. So we're talking a quality level up here, as well as versatility. So if that sounds interesting to you, you definitely need to check them out and their website, groundcontrol.coffee. Again, that website for the Ground Control Cyclops Brewer, groundcontrol.coffee. Today's episode is also brought to you by the Barista Series from Pacific. This is the line of plant-based performance beverages that is the choice for professional baristas all over the world, because it's created for them, really. It's created for baristas, and it is tested by some of the world's best baristas, so that the name performance beverage is not just a name. It's actually true. It will perform on the bar the way you always hoped a plant-based beverage would. Stands up to the heat from the steaming process, creates latte art in every drink, it has the ability to create that perfect texture, and the focus of the beverage, the flavor, is on the coffee. It's not overwhelmingly one flavor. It is harmonious with every one of your drinks. And this is a huge win for you and your customers. Check them out over at pacificfoodservice.com. Get this in your store and try it for yourself. If you're looking to serve your customers the best plant-based beverages possible, then you need to be serving them the Barista Series from Pacific. Okay, everybody. Well, today we have a very interesting conversation in store for you. We get pretty philosophical in this one, and it is a conversation that had its start in Instagram. There was a gentleman named Josh Tarlo who posted something about the concept of moral injury in specialty coffee. And I thought it was really interesting, and I agreed with a lot of things that was said, and I maybe disagreed with a couple of others or had some additional thoughts. And so I recorded myself in my car, in my house, and I just kind of put my thoughts out there for 17 minutes. You could see that over on Instagram at Keys to the Shop. But I decided that we needed to get into this a little bit more and invited Josh on the show to talk about the concept of moral injury, marketing, and the kinds of things that we promise but don't actually follow through on in the industry related to values, which is what moral injury more or less amounts to, where we force people to do things against their values and against their morals. And a lot of people in specialty coffee do feel this way towards the places that they work because they thought this is going to be one way, and here we are doing the opposite. And I feel pretty sleazy about this, It's not a new experience for specialty coffee professionals, but there's a lot of nuance in this conversation. So having Josh on the show was really exciting because we really got into it, and it is one of the longer episodes of Keys to the Shop, so it might be a two-parter for you. But I'm really excited about the content here because I think, again, it's really important. Now, Josh Tarlo himself is a specialty coffee professional who started in coffee when he was 16 years old. Has been in coffee for over 18 years now. He moved from working in cafes in Toronto to heading to Australia to work with places like Seven Seeds and Veneziano, where he got to take some time behind a roaster to end up in the UK as a green buyer at Origin, and now he's running the roastery and operations and wholesale departments for a coffee company in London called Kiss the Hippo. On top of working for some awesome coffee shops and being an accomplished coffee professional in those regards, Josh is also an accomplished competitor who got third in the Brewers Cup in Australia before heading home to Canada to take gold and getting third in the world in 2013. After that, in his roasting career, he had roasted coffee for competitors with 7 of the last 9 podium spots in the UK using coffee that he roasted. He took the UK title himself in 2018 and has also spent some time as a competition judge, including a Cup of Excellence judge. Today's conversation is kind of stuff that Josh talks about over on his website, JoshTarlo.com. And as I said, I think you're really going to find this an interesting conversation and maybe end up with a lot more questions than answers, but it is a deep topic, something that deserves our time, attention, and thoughts. And so let's get right to it. Here now is my conversation about marketing and moral injury with Josh Tarlo. Well, Josh, welcome to Keys to the Shop. Excited to talk with you today. How's it going?
It's going really well. Thanks for having me on there.
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of I don't think I've ever had this experience with bringing a guest on the show through this means of kind of just meeting you and becoming, familiar with your work through a post that was reposted. I forget where. It might have been on 50% Arabica, might have reposted it. And I followed it to your Instagram, and you posted about the topic of moral injury in coffee. I found that really fascinating, and I loved the topic and made a response video of sorts. And you had a response to that, and I thought, man, this is something we need to talk about on the show. And because the topic is actually pretty deep and pertinent to what's going on in coffee now. So this is exciting. And I mean, you've been in the coffee industry for quite a long time, almost 2 decades now, right?
Yeah. So it was like first job. So I've just never really gotten out of it. Starting out kind of as a barista, then doing it sort of all around the world from Australia to the UK, and then moving to the roastery side and green buying and all that sort of world. So it's a little bit in the blood by this point.
Yeah. So in your career, you've had a lot of success. You've been around the world. You've experienced the world of fine dining and the barista world, of course. Also, you're a barista champion in your own right, a couple of championships to your name. And so when you talk about the subject of moral injury, first, before we kind of dive into it, I'm curious about your perspective and how it's developed over time. Like you say, kind of stayed in coffee all these years. That changes a person, and you develop a perspective and a philosophy on what it's like to work in coffee from being a newbie to a seasoned pro. I mean, what's had the biggest impact over the years on your view of specialty coffee, like the business of specialty coffee today?
I've sort of, from the very beginning, had the same sort of thing that resonated with me about coffee. Is I worked in a neighborhood shop that was sort of the specialty coffee shop in town, but this was sort of like very, very early specialty. And I think the thing that originally really struck me was that it was just a very powerful place for communities to come together. And it was sort of this, the shop and the coffee, it was cool, but it was almost the excuse for people to connect. And that sort of base idea in coffee has sort of driven me through, whether it be anywhere around the world. You kind of see it in cafes, but then also kind of going up to what I do more now, which is on the roasting side of the green vine and that end, where you see that coffee becomes a mechanism to do other things. Like coffee's delicious, people love it, but it also operates in so many communities, from where it's made to where it's brewed as well, and then everywhere along the way. That means that because it's just active there, you get to use it to do things. And so I kind of had that feeling quite early, and it's sort of driven through as I've moved through those cycles of different places in the industry. And so from that business side, it's just it really comes more from that element of like, what does it let you do? Like what more than just making a coffee?
Right. So beyond the profession of coffee, it's just the stuff of life, like the things that it contributes to you as a person.
Yeah, it's like, I think all of us have many experiences of catching up with friends and family over coffee, whether it be in our kitchens or cafes. And I think it becomes like the thing we do as an excuse to get together. And so with that, you can kind of apply it in many different places. You sort of see what sort of opportunity does the fact that people want coffee let us do. It lets us, learn more about flavor. It lets us learn more about how different communities work. It lets us enrich communities. It lets us do things more justice. There's sort of like an endless list of what it lets us do just by kind of existence and people's desire for it.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. And so over the years, I think there has been a shift in that because, we have, I think in the past, coffee shops have always been that third space, and they continue to be a third space, not home, not work, but a community hub. It was almost like a given and on something that you didn't need to articulate, but these days, I think because of the commercial nature of coffee, it's proliferated a lot more concepts of chain coffee and the like. We have to almost reinsert it, as a concept like, remember, we're a third place. Remember, this is a community hub, and it becomes like a stated thing instead of like a no duh, this is a third place. You can obviously see that, like coffee shops from the 80s and 90s. You didn't really need to say that that's what it was. You could see it. Although today it feels like maybe there's a little bit more, because of the commercialization, the word might be sanitized approach to it, where we need to insert meaning to the commercial nature of it. I mean, I wonder what you think about that, if that's something that you've seen, and how successful have we been in creating or reinserting meaning into spaces that have been started maybe more as businesses and less as means to that values end.
Yeah, so I think this sort of relates through the life cycle that coffee has lived through, which is, specialty coffee is really kind of an interesting case study of how of expressing the neoliberal idea of that the best way for a market to operate isn't through like state control. The best way is that for a market to operate, the best way to find price and the best way to find demand is just like open it up and let people have the most freedom to be, buyers, sellers in it. And so that sort of neoliberal concept that the market will decide is a very specialty thing. That's where the quality thing is really, really rooted in. And so I think what we're seeing here is as things transitioned, and as that was kind of proven true, that people do want a certain quality of coffee. So you also got the financial speculation, and you got the investments from outside, and you got people willing to put down quite a bit of money because they saw, there's, the big returns that someone like Blue Bottle or Intelli or Stumptown was getting for just existing. And so I do think that you've got this evolution, but it's all rooted in this kind of early economics concept that then got applied to coffee. And I think on the idea of meaning, one of the sort of failures of the idea that the market will decide, and us kind of making the market operate in every aspect of our life, is we then have to answer the question of meaning. Why should we exist? And like, what's the purpose? And so if you're not somebody who like just wants to make a ton of cash and that's what you really want, and that's what gives you meaning in life, you then sort of like look to create meaning exterior to just being, somebody who makes something and sells something. And so then you get that that sort of, I feel like that's the tension place we're in right now, with cafes have moved away from a meaning thing because they really embodied this idea of the market. And now they're kind of having a bit of a crisis. And I think it's sort of a crisis across the industry about what is the meaning? Why are we doing this? Why should we care? Why should we keep making coffee? And so you're seeing that kind of play out, and you are seeing it in cafes where they went from sort of like a bunch of independents that all look the same. Like they were all like, they basically were chains. And because they did that, because it was a really effective way to operate in the market, people wanted it, people bought it. So, you might as well fit out your cafe quite like somebody else. And now you're kind of hitting this point where it's like, I'm not sure about it in the States, but here in the UK, you got a lot of takeaway only. And like, so people are really disconnecting for the purpose and the reason that the cafes originally were successful and what they were in terms of powerful for the community. And so with that, you sort of have this new sort of crisis where if cafes are sort of just dispensaries for quality coffee, then they sort of need to rather get immediately incredibly good at doing that at scale, like making millions in coffees, because that's what the people entering the marketplace will do, or they need to inject meaning back into their existence. And so it is sort of like a funny transition point right now.
The meaning to justify existence, or kind of the existence as the meaning itself. And that's a question that comes to my mind in this conversation, because of the idea that being very successful in your coffee shop today means that you can, down the value stream, see somebody who, as a farmer, is more successful because you're successful. And it's when you talk about sustainability, for example, a lot of people that we've had on the show will say they talk to people on the farms. They say, what can we do to help you? And say, sell more coffee. That's a lot of what they say. And like, be more successful, expand, and do so in a healthy way, and stay in business. And so in a sense, it's like our new value seems to be united under the banner of, like you said, we're dispensaries of coffee. And in a little bit more of a sense, we're sort of like faithful representatives of the coffee that's being grown to the masses. And yet at the same time, we have this desire to add more to it than simply the transaction that is itself meaningful, because it does have impact on how others can create livelihood for themselves. But I'm curious about how this idea of continuing to be financially successful and impacting the entire value chain meets the need for the community it serves to also have meaning expressed in that business that's not necessarily that, the financial piece.
I think kind of the thing about coffee here is that people listening and are thinking about these ideas might be inclined to sort of put them where their position in the industry is and sort of see it from that spot. So if you're like a neighborhood shop and you're in like Kentucky in a small town or something like that, then your experience of coffee is just going to be so much different than maybe this idea of these like big over financialized massive firms is going to be. And so I think that the one of the big things that are happening here is that there's just tons of different kinds of coffee. So people, I think oftentimes when they're sort of exploring these ideas, are typically exploring them from their position and which makes sense because they're like this lived experience of it all. But when we sort of just look at the sort of the bigger companies, like where the money is happening, I think the trouble that you have with this meaning question is that as a company becomes successful and they do sell more coffee and they get to buy more coffee from the producer, they'll become a more attractive purchase for outside people looking to make a speculative investment. And so as these companies get bigger and bigger, they won't be able to be purchased by, say, another roastery. They just, because other roasteries just might not have the cash to do it. They're all kind of around the same size, say. So instead, what tends to happen is they get purchased by a really big company that is more a financial company. They're not just the coffee company. They do a bunch of stuff. And that's where I think you risk with the producers having the challenge, because then essentially the only way to get a return on that investment is bigger sales and cut down on costs. And so the idea is that, they're probably going to try to do both of those things. And so with that becomes the question of sourcing standards, and will they be retained? Will they continue? And so that whole sell more good coffee is great for quite a while, and it's great for a lot of people in coffee, and it does work. But then I think what we are running into is, like, as these big kind of behemoths come in, they then have different goals and objectives. They have different horizons where they want to see the investment return. They're not trying to build a company to have a job. They're trying to get a return. They're trying to flip that company, or they're trying to get like enough cash coming into it to pay them back. So I think there is that kind of few different things existing, and then it will kind of depend who you are. But when it really talking about the big ones, I think there is actually a risk in that whole just sell more.
Right. So the people in independent coffee shops, I think, then would look at those examples and see them as, without knowing exactly what's going on behind the scenes, maybe things to emulate themselves. Do you feel like there's a little bit of a mirroring that happens when people see the success of another coffee shop and they think, well, this is the kind of, look how successful they are. My small, 2 retail store shop in my town should do what they're doing. Do you feel like that happens? And then what does the independent risk by doing that, outside of the fact that they don't have VC investment and the like?
I think that, like, a lot of people underestimate how much maybe massive companies just waste so much money. And so they'll do things that from the exterior might be like, oh, that's working, they're big. But it's not necessarily like the bigger companies that I've been part of or I've seen operate, what I find really interesting is just how limited of products are really driving revenue, and how there's a bunch of other stuff which kind of breaks even or just does a little bit of the money. And sometimes that other stuff is what's influencing coffee culture. And so it's kind of a fascinating thing when you get these small companies sort of like looking at, I don't know, like a brew bar, or maybe, right, like a pour over bar. And they're just like, oh, that's really cool, we got to install one of those. It's like those things like never make money. And like they're never big profit centers. They're part of like the culture of bringing people into that cafe, but it's not like you make one and then you get to print money. And so if you're a really small business and you've got X amount of capital to figure out a return with, like, you got to make it work and do something. I think sometimes there is that risk of looking at these different things and thinking like, well, they're doing that, so I should do that. Well, that just might not be the best way for you to spend your limited amount that you have. So I think that whole big companies influencing culture thing, there is sort of that danger there where people don't really know what's happening behind the drapes, and they see that they think that there's a bigger thing than there actually is.
If you could think about the overarching, for the independent mid 2 to 3 stores, they have a roastery, and they're a small to mid-sized coffee roaster retail operator. What would you say is the main driving set of values that people have when they start coffee shops today that may be in contrast to what they used to be?
What I have noticed is that from when I was coming up and I interacted with the sort of the people who own shops at that time versus, say, some of the ones I see now, I definitely see a lot more of people not really having an interest in working in the business that much anymore. coffee shops sort of had this there seemed to be they weren't exactly like something that like a rich person opened. Like they obviously had money. They could open a cafe, which is like way more rich than a lot of folks. But like it wasn't that sort of I'm gonna open this like place that I'm gonna spend like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds or dollars on, and then I'm gonna make a return and stuff. And so I do think one of the challenges that they have is that, you got to sell a lot of lattes to make a business work. And so I think that when we're looking at some of the changes I've seen, it's just like these sort of unrealistic budgets that for the ROI to make sense, it's just like you have to sell so much. You like, if you want that really expensive bit of real estate to open your cafe, and you want to put out tons of money into making it look nice, you're just going to find it really hard to make that return. And so I think that that's kind of a way away from the sort of person who's just like very DIY. I want to open a shop because I just want to make coffee and have a cafe and work there. And I'm not saying that old model was perfect. I just mean like it is definitely a change.
Yeah, it does seem like a change. That is the status quo now, I think, for better, for worse, because you've got connection. You see on Instagram all the examples. There's just pages about beautiful coffee shops. They're not even coffee shops themselves. It's just like Instagram pages dedicated to beautiful build outs. No idea, like you can't have an Instagram page dedicated to beautiful / profitable coffee shops, because you can't really show that profitability in that, or the impact that they're having. And I think a lot of this is sort of inherited by anybody opening up a coffee shop. It would be really hard for them to buck against the trend and feel like they're going to be successful amidst the sea of competitors that are sort of bought into that philosophy already. And so it kind of brings us to the idea of moral injury itself, where, it's really based on values and how actions may or may not line up with values. But I wanted to ask you just, what is the concept of moral injury, and where do we see it most manifest in specialty coffee right now?
Yeah, so it's sort of a funny one to go through, because like where its origins are obviously much more severe than the context that I'm sort of bringing up in. But so it starts out as when looking at veterans as a separate thing to PTSD. And basically they were finding that it wasn't responding to the same treatments. And it was about people who had rather done something directly against their morals because they were told to, or that they abided by when something was happening. And so it started there, and then it moved over, and it was also looked at in healthcare. And people saw it as like a doctor who, just wants to help people and do good, but their treatments just financially ruin families because of just the system that exists in the States. And so then it was also looked at kind of, when I had first encountered it was with an interview with Roger Karma, and he was bringing up in regards to the idea of being this like highly educated person going into management consultant and then just basically laying off people. And he was just like, what am I doing with my life? And I kind of heard something in there that really resonated with coffee, that because coffee has this high population of people kind of projecting meaning onto coffee, it becomes this vehicle to be creative, be in a community, do good, like have these, like live your ethics. But then it also has the reality that it's kind of a really hard business. It's a very low priced product, which means that there's a lot of people not getting paid particularly well in it. There's a lot of people that are sort of asked to do things that they disagree with. And so there's sort of a confrontation with that. And if you've been in the industry long enough, usually you've developed a lot of skills that you're going to start to get hired by companies. And this is what I've observed with a few friends, where really they're like, I've become this like super qualified person in coffee, and now I'm working for an importer, and we're just like completely not supporting producers in any way contrary to what we talk about. And so like you sort of hear this like, oh yeah, you got into this industry because you cared and you had a lot of passion for it, and you got this job because, you know, all these companies sort of advertise these mission driven ethics, and then they start working there, and then there's like, so yeah, we're just going to need you to have to do like a negative differential on this coffee in or like or we'll have to do very small or just buy it for C or whatever. And they're sort of like, what the hell is this? This isn't why I got this job. This was like not what they told me it was going to be like. This is very different. But then they're in this position where like there's very few jobs that pay well in coffee. And so they're kind of like, well, you know, I want a career and I can't just job hop. There aren't that many jobs. So you might be a specialist. So you're the only person who can get the job, but it's not like there's like millions of these jobs about. So they're kind of in that challenge where they're just like, so I have to keep kind of doing this, I guess. Is this all my life is going to be? And it's that feeling, that sort of lost feeling that kicks in.
Asking you to kind of betray your values, your morals, thus the moral injury. And if you feel like you've lost that, what are the other consequences for that? Because I could guess it going one of two ways. Like somebody might experience a feeling of betrayal and say, I am never going to get a job in a place like this again unless I'm like 100% positive and I'm going to make a difference. And it just steals their resolve and deepens their values even more. But then there's others that may use that or say that it is kind of they've lost their love for coffee and it completely shatters them. I guess maybe both are possible, but what would you say the consequences tend to be?
Yeah, so where I think it really concerns me is kind of in the two spots where one, it does have this destroying effect on people's sort of interest and things that they care about and feeling passionate. And it sort of kicks in this other way where it's not just like, oh, this thing I cared about sucks. It's this other bit of like, what have I spent the last X amount of years doing? And then where like, I'm so specialist, how do I get another job? So there's like a lost feeling that kicks in that, you know, what do you do? I think why industry leadership should kind of care about this is that we risk losing really talented people from the industry. You know, I've recently sat down and had some dinner with a couple of green buyers, and the conversation about somebody who had left coffee came up. And it kind of moved to this space of them talking about like, oh, I could be a buyer of anything. Like maybe, you know, I was thinking about going into like grocery. And these are people who have won competitions, have had award-winning coffees, and they're just like, you know what? Maybe I'll just work for a nice grocery store, just like buying their whatever products. And so I think there is this really real human cost, which then will be an industry cost as well, because I think there seems to be people who are more willing to say enter another industry with their eyes open to like, oh, this is just to make a buck. So I'm just going to maximize the ability for me to make money. But because coffee doesn't pay like these ridiculously great wages, there is an intrinsic part of it where, you know, someone's saying like, you get to work in the industry you love. We're not going to pay you like amazingly well. We're going to pay you all right. But we're going to make you compromise all the time. And so these people are like, I'd rather work in an industry that's like morally neutral, but they don't pretend to be this ethical thing, and they'll pay me better to do it. So there is a real cost to it.
In that scenario, what do you think would have happened with the person who's, you know, postulating the idea that they're going to leave this role and to go be in supermarket chain or something? What would have happened if the company they worked for, hypothetically, said less about ethics and was upfront about some of the stuff that they need to do to make money and sold that ethical part less? Do you feel like, at least if they had gone in with their eyes open, that person would not have, you know, got to the point where they thought, I want to go work for a supermarket? Is it just the feeling of betrayal, do you think? Or is it purely financial, or both?
I think betrayal is part of it, but it's not all of it, because it's happening. Like, I don't think the answer is like companies promise less ethical behavior. I think because you see it across the people who promise a lot and the people who don't do it at all. So I think what the challenge is your supply of people to work in the industry have these things that they're passionate about. And so you, as someone who owns a company, wants to attract good talent. And so this is part of that attract. Like, how do you get them? And so you're sort of, I think this is sort of what you have to do to get the people to make these great products that you care about. And I think part of this thing of like, just say, if you under promise, then you'd be fine. I don't think that works, because you're also not paying people the wages that are the same as if they were to work in these other industries, right? So you're then not only financially giving them less, you're then giving them less, value and the ability for them to express meaning through their work. So it would be even worse, I think.
Okay, so then with the fact that the market requires you to, have a certain kind of return on your investment, you have to have a business that operates profitably, and you can't have a purely idealistic business. What is the answer for people who need to, and there is value in being commercially stable and financially, just making it work for all the people who depend on it for a living? Maybe it's not going to create a moral paradise for those who enter it. How does a business communicate and market in such a way that gives people a correct impression of what it's like to work there, and also keeping moral injury at bay?
Yeah, so I don't actually think this is like a paradise thing that people are sort of looking for. I think what they're looking for is a proactive workplace that correctly talks about what they actually are and what they care about. I think, when I speak to people who are opening shops, which we talk a lot to because of wholesale, there is this element of it where you kind of need to say to them, like, you can go in with all these ideas of like what you're going to do, but if you're not like in your guts interested and passionate about that thing, because it's a small business, it just will not happen. You just won't do it. You will become uninterested. You won't have the energy for it. It'll be the first thing that falls away when you're tired and when the money's not like piling in. So I think when people are opening these businesses, a big part of what they have to really ask themselves is like, what gets them out of the bed, and like what makes them passionate and excited. And that's when the values thing kicks in. So what they need to do is figure out the values that the company itself cares about. And the way you do that is you talk to people and you connect with people. You have the conversations when you around the table, you start like discussing what do we want to do this year? What goals do we have for the next 5 years? So what is our pathway? And then how can we figure out the stuff that, really does get us excited, so that one, it has the biggest return for the people working in the business, because they'll be excited about it. They'll have buy-in because they'll like care and they'll have been part of the conversation. And you, as the person who owns the thing, will also be able to have that energy, because you'll be able to express the thing that you actually care about, not sort of that, I look online and I'm supposed to like really care about this thing, and so I make it part of my USP, right? And that just sort of fails. So I think it's often that sort of failure of leadership that is really happening.
No, I agree. I think the onus is definitely on the companies to communicate correctly about what their values are and what their intentions are and our goals. I like how you put that, in what we're actively working on doing. And at the same time, I think because a lot of people who work in a place that don't own it, or maybe not in a place of leadership where they have access to the gears that are turning behind the scenes, might view even just talking about it and not acting on it immediately as somebody avoiding being responsible with their values. No matter what you say, sometimes it seems like you couldn't win because people just want you to do things now, or they see inaction as as proof that people are avoiding accountability for the values that they say they have, when in fact it is necessary when operating a business to do things that don't excite you sometimes. So because if you're an importer of green coffee, not every single coffee is going to be something that just makes your heart swoon. But it has a place, and part of the job is to put that in the hands of someone whose heart is happy with it. But not all of your employees are just going to be jazzed about it. So the question is, how do you go about setting up your marketing and your values in a way that gives people the idea that we're not always going to be living in this sweet spot of seeing our values every single day and every decision that we make, but we are going to be working towards them. Sometimes I do think people are unfairly painted with a brush of apathy when in fact they're just trying to keep their business going, and they are working towards those goals, but they have the realities of business to worry about also that people who work for them don't have to worry about.
There's kind of a few things happening here. I think you're absolutely right. Business owners are often just trying to survive, especially early days. And so there is that challenge. But I think there is an implicit belief that survival equals that you've done the thing that's better. And I think the thing that I have a growing concern about is more and more I'm seeing business models. Well, they've always existed, but I've seen a lot of them more in coffee, which are intrinsically impossible to deliver success on without compromising your values. Like, it's just not possible because the margins or because of the structure that you've built. You're just gonna you see this say like McDonald's doesn't work without killing a bunch of animals, right? Like, it's just so it is part of what they do. And so I think that there's versions of this where you see this say in rather pricing, or you see this in the locations people pick and the high prices that they have, and they don't have the kind of cash flow that it's like, oh, well, you can't open a shop there without really your labor has to be so cheap, like just so cheap to make that work. If you don't have like tons of money in the bank to let it run for 18 months or something, or a couple of years. So what I think that there's a part here that people really do have to ask themselves of like, are you creating something that will let you live your values just by the model? If you're a vegan, you can't open a McDonald's without killing animals. So like, obviously, like, you can't live that value, right? So people need to be careful about the business models that they create, and will they intrinsically allow them to live their values? And I think that's sort of that first question when they're appraising the business model and the sort of mission of the business and the values of the business is like, can I even do these things that I'm saying within the context of this? So you want to set up the macro values that you believe in, then that you can operate under. So when the thing is just functioning, your decision making is informed by those values. So, when you're just kind of busy surviving, then whatever decision you're making, you're kind of just asking like, does it let me do this thing? Does it let me live up to this? Yes or no? And if the answer is no, then you just don't do it. So I think you have to figure out the model that lets you do that. And so I do think it is kind of a first principles question, because once you've opened your doors, it's almost too late, and you've already committed to the context of that you'll be participating in the marketplace.
So what is it that lets people live their values in a business?
Well, I think it's focusing in on the values that are deliverable within that context, right? Like, I think if you want to pay people decently, if you believe in that, if you believe, say, like over here, we have the London living wage. And so if you're kind of like, okay, I want to make sure that people get paid, I don't do the minimum wage, I do the London living wage. You then have to be like, all right, so what is my menu? Like, how much do I charge for stuff? What am I looking at when it comes to my rent? And like, so how much rent can I afford? Because it's going to impact my ability to staff it. Like, what is the layout of the business? Is it many floors? Will I require lots of staff? So lots of turnover. Does this let me give it? All these things will then put pressure on your staffing. And then you'll start to be kind of like, oh, it'd be really easy if I could pay them less. Because I still need those people to exist to live out this space that I've committed to. But, unfortunately, like the living wage is too much. So in that moment, you've picked a context that doesn't let you live your value. And so I think it's being quite clear about what you care about and what you want that business to be, and then communicate that, and then put those decision-making through it.
So you're really describing the business model as something that needs to afford you the financial stability to see those values carried forward.
Yeah, exactly. Like otherwise it won't work, because you'll just have to compromise them. Because between like declaring bankruptcy and living your values, most people will go against their values before they want to like pack in their whole livelihood.
Okay, then. So then there's the other kind of animal that is someone who is super profitable, and yet their values are not being lived out in the business, at least not from what the staff can tell. What's behind that?
Well, I think this is that really weird contradiction that you'll often get, where people will, be proactive in their community in some way. Like, I don't know, say it's their church, or they'll be, maybe they donate money to something, but then they'll have like crushing sort of wages that they give to people. Like, I guess the big example you might see is like Walmart or something, right? Like they, as people say they have these values, but then obviously as a company don't live up to them. And so I do think that there's this kind of old idea, and this is kind of going back to the neoliberal thing, where you're at the mercy of the marketplace and your ability to act as efficiently in that market and being competitively in that marketplace, because that's the game that we're in. And then these people will then compromise their values in the workplace, and then when they go home at the end of the day, they then pretend that's the person they really are, not the thing that they're spending their whole lives creating. So I just don't think that there can be a disconnect between those things. I don't think you can like run an oil company and like go home and be like, I'm a great person. Like, they're just intrinsically, they're contrary to each other.
So if I was a owner of a coffee shop, it would behoove me to select really not all this like banquet, this buffet of values that I see on the market, where you mentioned this a little bit earlier, how, oh, that's a good value and that's a good value. I'm just going to take those, and that's what coffee shops do. Like, you have to feel it in your gut, and it feels like you should just choose like one or two, because if you overcommit yourself to saying, oh, and we're going to do this, and we're going to change the world in these 12 ways, you are kind of setting yourself up for failure, because your business model probably couldn't sustain that. Starting off in a realistic scenario where you show throughput of those values in the first few years, like maybe one or two things that you do super well, is much better than picking 5 or 6 that you just barely touch.
Yeah, I think it's this, people who own businesses need to be honest with the fact that businesses are like the only dictatorship that we are okay with in our day-to-day lives. Like, we have democratic countries, but we don't have democratic workplaces. The democracy expressed in the workplace by someone leaving the business, like, that's not how it really works, like proactive engagement. So business owners, that you can make a decision and be like, okay, I'm going to create more workplace democracy, but most of them just have it as this sort of like dictatorship, essentially. Sure. And so I think they have to be realistic that they're the biggest influence on that business and the biggest influence on the day-to-day operation. And so if they kind of scattergun it and they try to do too many things that are unachievable, instead of creating roadmaps to achieving them, they're just going to kind of fail at everything. Most of the biggest mistakes I usually see is that there's just no roadmap to achieve the values that they're actually talking about. So they'll have like some value that they say, and then it's just, how do you get there?
Right.
And I think that employees, those sort of roadmaps really resonate with people. They, if you can kind of lay out, this is, we've got meetings in the books already for achieving that, for the next step in achieving that goal that we have, then the employee can look at their calendar and be like, June, 15th, we got a meeting where we move to the next step. And then like they can feel that progression. They can feel something actually building and being constructed. But yeah, if you sort of focus on everything, you just won't have the time to do anything. And so people do need to be honest about that. And then honest when they're recruiting. And then they can kind of convey that and they can get people more excited about it.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. And the idea that also cafes are co-created entities, and that there's a lot of expertise, inside that business. In everyone has a mind, everyone's an adult, working there, and so many coffee shops do go the route of saying, we started with the intention of having a coffee shop that is very simple values of serving the community great coffee, right? But then, because of who is coming to the coffee shop and who is working at the coffee shop, those people, and not necessarily the boss, like the owner, start to be the ones that influence the way that the values work. So the values are born organically from the existence of the coffee shop and not necessarily from the business plan of the coffee shop. So we've got those as well.
Yeah, so this is that sort of next step where you start recruiting people, and then they're going to want to apply their agency, and then you sort of have to make that decision, like to be competitive in the marketplace of hiring people. I'm going to have to start taking this stuff on, right? I'm going to have to like listen to it and adapt or not. Right. And so I think part of this is where you come up with those macro sort of like values you care about, and then what feeds into them. Like if kind of like ensuring that everyone you work with can have a decent living, or say that's the value, then when someone comes on and they might have, racial justice, maybe something they really care about, there's ways of then making those values work together and be like, yeah, like let's look at our hiring practices and make sure that, we're hiring from, we get better at that. So we see our blind spots. So I think that you can kind of bring those values together. But I think you just have to be sort of open that the moment you open the business, and if you really do want to attract talent and people, you're going to have to take it on. So although it does still is this dictatorship, like any dictatorship, you just still got to make people happy with your existence, yeah. Or they will they'll get rid of you by you just not having anybody. So you do have to kind of work with people. But I think how you have to do that is just being sure about your values, and then being honest about how do you integrate them in and how do you make it work. And I think that scattergun thing that does happen when a lot of people join is largely just because of the lack of focus of actually doing anything in the business, that people come to work every day and it's the same thing essentially. And so then anything that comes to mind sort of gets brought up, and it becomes this sort of like minutia of ideas as opposed to focus, which brings people to look at what they want to do and look at what they can do, and then roadmaps to it. I really just think that focus thing really just sort of solves a lot of those problems, because you don't just end up being a bunch of people chatting. You have people who have objectives and goals.
Yeah, it's on paper. We're working towards it. Absolutely. And we're really self-satisfied oftentimes with the clever, word crafting that we put into our plans and our placards and things like that. But the real work is in the doing day to day. And, not also discounting the fact that I think we do underestimate the value of doing the basics well, doing like it might be the like living wage, for example, like paying people really well. I always say, pay people what you absolutely can, not what you can get away with. And if that's a value, that's a basic, along with serving consistently great coffee. Like even just staying in business as a business these days is a feat in and of itself for a lot of people, and that provides jobs. And people. There's a place I worked here in Louisville that one of their values and goals was they want to employ people so that they can provide a living for their families. And that was one of their values and goals. And obviously that drives a lot of the intention behind decisions in all of the small and big areas of the business. But it's still a very basic value. It's not like a top level headline news type value. It's just good business, stable and successful people in the business. And you could pretty much call it a day at that point and still have a big impact on the your community and, frankly, the industry of coffee.
Yeah, I think this actually tags into like one of the probably one of the biggest challenges is about values, is that they a lot of them, no one's going to say congratulations for doing it, because all you've done is the thing that it should be. Like, if you pay your staff enough that they can live a decent life, that isn't necessarily something that they should be like thanking you all the time for. That's just like actually how this should all work. And so I imagine there's a bit of, you kind of see this a bit of a tension point sometimes when I've seen this with around the living wage, talking to some people where they'll be like, oh, they're not even that thankful. And it's like, I mean, they're thankful that you're not paying them the bare minimum. Like they're that thanks only goes so far. It's not really like you've done something amazing. What you've done is like what you've lived up to this basic idea. And I think one of the challenges is people also have to be realistic of like, getting the return on these values isn't some sort of congratulations, like, so isn't some big like, oh, we're so stoked the industry is gonna go on about you. A lot of it's just like you get to be the person that you want to be. That's what you've done, and it's for you as much as it's for them. It's not like you're doing something for someone. What you're doing is you're actually being able to be the person that you believe in. And so I do see that some people don't get the buzz from that, and what they really want is the buzz, not to actually live out the values. And so the living a decent life and paying your people a decent wage so they can do that is one of those big ones. I've definitely heard from business owners when there's like they're not thankful enough, and it's always kind of surprising. It's like you're paying them the living wage, not you're not giving them $1 million. They're just getting by.
Well, it kind of shows that they don't actually believe that as a value, and in that they're expecting that it's because if I have a value, that means if I live it out, I am satisfied by living it out, and I'm in touch with my integrity. If they're saying, oh well, here's the thing, we've achieved it, and they're not happy with that, then like I'm satisfied to provide for my son, for example. I am happy that I'm doing it, but sometimes I don't need to hear him say, thank you for not letting me starve to death every single day. That's just a given. It's not something that I don't need that kind of that feedback and affirmation to keep me from, doing that, thankfully. But it does show that we need to own those values ourselves. And the backs of those who are working in coffee, who operate with integrity and often in anonymity, is what the industry is built on. It's not necessarily a lot of the flashy things. It's people who are just working and doing things well and consistently that gives us sort of a leg up. 20 years, you and I have been in, for the better part of 2 decades, seeing the progress of the industry. It's not without its challenges, of course, but there's millions of people who are just doing the work every day, and they're doing it well, and they're satisfied to do it. And maybe we need more of that.
Yeah, like it's difficult because it's the spectacle thing. It's very seducing to have those sort of those one-line things, or the great image or post thing that gets you excited, which everyone does. Like I'll get stoked as well. It is really kind of hard because every day isn't lives like everyone's life isn't mundane, but like it's obviously exciting when something like different happens and it's positive. So people get kind of addicted to it. I don't necessarily think it's like an all bad thing. I just think that what's kind of interesting about it, and this is going back to the idea of moral injury, is that if all you're addicted to is the headlines, then when people are living it day to day, that's when they're going to start to feel that pain, because they're going to see that gap in that you're just attracted to headlines. Like what your value actually is people like saying congratulations. And so what they're actually seeing is like you lying, not only to them, but often to themselves. Like the owners are lying to themselves of what they care about. And so I think that's where that kind of pain comes from, is this, you're living this sort of lie. And so you're this employee kind of like, this is kind of nonsense. I'm sort of like lying for this person every day because I'm saying this is the values, but this isn't the values. It's not how it's working. And so I'm coaxed into supporting the system. And then, say you have a wholesale account, or you're a green person selling some coffee to a roastery, or, say you're a barista just lying about, where your milk comes from or whatever, you're forced into these positions of living a falsehood, and you're being coerced into it because the idea is like, well, where am I going to get a job other than this? Like, where can I get one? Like, it's hard to change jobs. It's like a very difficult thing to do. It's it looks worse on your resume if you jump around a lot, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So people sort of, are in that sort of pain if it doesn't actually happen. And it is hard because you're essentially asking people who are starting businesses or owning businesses to be like, what are your values, and live them. And some people will come back being like, I don't really have many values I care about that much. Like, I'm not like going to killing people, but I don't also need the thing I'm not, there's nothing I really care that much about that I need to live every day. And I think that's a bit where the challenge is, because those people also still want to open businesses. And that's where I get in a little bit of that difficulty, because it's very seductive to then just state that these are your values and then not live up to them at all. And then try to hire people based off of them so you can attract the talent to make your business competitive enough. And so I think that's where you get a lot of that kind of problem and conflict.
Yeah. Yeah. And to that point, if somebody says, well, I don't have a lot of these values that you're talking about, I just want to run a coffee shop, and that's what I want to do. And I want to run a good coffee shop. I say, good. And you should. And the problem is, like you say, when you start trying to market it as something more than when you know it is, then that's where that problem comes in. But if they just didn't do that and they just said, we just want to run a great coffee shop and treat people right, and it's almost impossible to do this without values. People just need to kind of sit down and think about really what they're after here. I think when you're starting a small coffee shop, there's probably one or two things you're really trying to do if you had to think about it. But in the simplicity of just running a great business, there is value. It's just when you get yourself in hot water, is like what you say. You take on things that aren't necessarily true, but you feel like you need to take them on. And if you could just stop yourself before that happens, then you probably avoid the whole mess to begin with.
Well, I think one of the worst, where this kind of plays in the worst, is that there's a lot of coffee businesses where they essentially exist because the person who wanted to start it liked the idea of a coffee business, and they saw themselves as the owner of a coffee business. And so all what the employees are actually doing every single day they go to work, they're not selling to customers, they're selling to the boss this idea of a coffee shop that they get to own. And the customers are just sort of like props that validate this sort of idea. And so the values don't matter, because what it actually is not an act of like, oh, I'm going to do this thing. It's an act of consumption. They're just consumers, except for the thing that they're buying this time is a business. And they're going to live this sort of like idea of being in a business. And I think that's a lot of where these problems have. And you see a lot of these businesses where you're just like, this business model does not make much sense. It's like very much this person's personality. And I don't understand how it's going to work. The people working here hate it. And it's just sort of this, and because it's all sort of a fantasy, because, if you've got some money, you can open whatever you want, and people let you. And so you do see these sort of bosses that are just sort of not actually owning coffee businesses, but they're consumers of coffee businesses. And I think that's where you get a lot of these sort of problems.
Right. Yeah. And I don't think we can conflate that type of person with the individual who may not have like a values list, but does want to operate a really good coffee shop. Because a lot of them, people that do get into it for that reason, have some of the best coffee shops out there and some of the happiest employees and customers who do get to see a service to their community. And a lot of people that start it, even if they're not completely aware of all that they're getting into, which we've lots of episodes on the show talking about bad reasons to open a coffee shop, with the idea that you should think through these things before you do it. You learn as you go. A lot of times, even if you have all of the experience, you're still learning as you go. You're discovering what it is that you're operating that coffee shop for as you go too. Sometimes it just takes the first step. And so rather than saying you should only open a coffee shop unless it's like this fully formed child, rather it should have some pretty essential elements of know that you're going to have to consistently live out your values, whatever they are, but you don't have to have everything completely lined up, ready to go, 10-year plan, all that stuff, because it is a process of discovery when you're opening a coffee shop. And so I think there are a lot of people who do, like you say, they're consumers of coffee shops. They'll buy it, and it's like an ego thing for them, and there are plenty of them out there. But then there are other people who do open a coffee shop because they really want to open a coffee shop, but they're great bosses. They run a good business. They serve their community well, and they might say, "I don't know, if we have any values per se. We just want to run a good business."
Yeah, I don't. I definitely think when I say that they're consumers, I just mean more in the sense of to make a good any business, you have to do things that, like, you have to create something of value for the consumer, right? And to make it work, you need to have people who can implement it. So you have to give them value too. What I mean to say is that there's definitely, and this is kind of the modern version of coffee, where people have a lot of money and they open something and it just sort of exists. And it's a bit of a market distortion because they can only exist because they've got tons of cash. And so they put a competitive pressure against other people in the industry who don't have that sort of just well of money to be able to pull from, to live this sort of idea. And so it becomes its own sort of challenge, because then you're going against this, coffee shop down the street, which has poured, $500,000 into their fit out. No one can make that return, but they're so rich, it doesn't matter. And so when I say that kind of consumer thing, I think it's actually like a really big challenge for the industry, because it distorts our ability to deliver in a way that is actually financially sustainable. It's not that you need to, be a perfect thing every time. It's just a perfect coffee shop when you need to open your doors. But it's this more the idea of like, sometimes these folks just can't, they're not really actually trying to deliver value for the consumer. What they're doing is trying to deliver value for themselves. Right. That should be the byproduct of delivering value to consumers and the people working in the business.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and I think there are, because of the fact that coffee has become what it is today, and the markets are so saturated, there's lots of opportunity for those types of businesses to be opened, which opens up opportunity for smaller businesses to deliver value in different ways outside of the fit out, because we not only have eyes, but we have other senses too, so we can see it's beautiful, good, hardwood tables and all that fun stuff. But the experience itself, you can compete. If you're an operator with more integrity and more engagement in your community, you can definitely compete with those, automaton-like shops that open up, the ego shops, by delivering consistent value. And it kind of comes right back to the conversation of saying, if you deliver that consistently and you have a plan for that, even if there's market distortion, people will feel that difference and frequent your place more. That's why some shops that people are just like, yeah, it's more like a second wave shop, and it's not as, they don't have the fancy pour overs and the geisha coffees and that stuff. But guess what? They're still in business and they are busting it out. They're doing well, and they are providing for their employees, and people love them because the experience is consistent, it's positive, and it's got integrity.
Yeah, it's really, those shops, I don't know, it's really interesting because they do exist. Like, I think if you speak to most roasteries, their biggest seller will probably be, like, they might have a house coffee and that might be their biggest one, but definitely their at least biggest or second biggest is going to be a dark roast blend. And it's going to be probably darker than anything else they do. And I think that just like really pins to how so many of these shops are not actually like, geisha shops. They're doing something else. They're just like smashing out flat whites, and that's the bread and butter, and it works. So those do exist. I think the challenge you get into, And this is where this idea of like where you position yourself, where you are in the business, is where you'll kind of like view the industry in total. Is as these big over financialized coffee businesses continue to grow, and as new ones come up, as those, you know, that independent shop opens like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10, and then has a roastery, and they get bought up again, it's sort of, it will change the culture of what's going on in coffee, and it will change how coffee operates, because they're going to have enough money, and they'll have you know, then this next wave, which is probably going to be hyper convenience, is what it kind of is growing into, is scale and hyper convenience. It's just something that small businesses cannot easily compete on. You know, it'd be like the Deliveroo thing, where restaurants can't compete with the Deliveroo model of just burning through money to make it work. You know, just like a lot of shops couldn't compete with Amazon. And so we're going to have that version that's going to happen to us. And the challenge, I think, of these like smaller shops and more traditional shops is, how do they adapt to that when, you know, when people will be able to get that coffee delivered to their house within a few minutes, when they're going to be able to have the perfect flat white in the office from a machine. And it's going to be, how do you adapt to that? And these really great shops that have been around for 10, 20, 30 years, whatever, they are really good, but I do think they're going to have a challenge once a lot of the tech stuff really kicks in for coffee, because we just haven't had it yet. But it's definitely, like, you're already seeing it around this, like these ideas of amazing bean to cup machines, the idea of like the deliver coffee in 5 minutes. And it's really going to hit, especially in urban places. And so it will be interesting to see how those kind of shops survive. Because they're going to be under pressure against not coffee companies. They're going to be under pressure against tech companies, and, you know, financial service companies is really who they're competing with.
Yeah, it's interesting. We'll have to keep an eye on that. I mean, the idea that we have laptops, and we also have people still making things on Etsy. So you're using these pieces of technology to access things made by hand. Still in the market. So it's like, how are these shops going to, how are these shops going to iterate their values in a technologically advanced world? You know, talking about the values being lived out seems like one of the main things that you would have as a competitive edge. So avoiding moral injury by having a more conscientious way of approaching and a plan for executing your values is a distinctly human kind of connection that you can make, that a technologically advanced market might not be able to tap into based on its model, you know, that's probably built on more exploitation than just a small coffee shop that is inconsistent with their values.
I guess this is sort of a lot of the kind of questions of that do exist, is this idea of like, will we prefer a simulacra of the real thing, and will we just settle for that, and that works? Or do we actually crave something that is real? And I guess like that's the thing, we don't actually have that very clear answer with. Like, we don't know if people really, when they talk about, oh, I want something real, what they mean is they want something like what, you know, they are familiar with. Like, I think one of the biggest analogies in this is like, people in the UK often talk about pastoral land as, they're like, oh, this is like nature. Well, the UK used to be a forest, but because it's been pastoral land for, 600 years, 500 years, that's what they view as nature as now. And so they're not actually viewing the real thing as nature. They're viewing the thing that they remember from their childhood. And so what will happen when we sort of move to this next space? Like, will people actually really miss the coffee shop? Or will they, if it's going to exist once, 30 years go by, is it just going to sort of fall away because it's going to be something people don't really remember and think that much about?
I think part of our job is going to be to give them something to miss, at least something visceral to remember when we're all gone and we're in the metaverse, I guess. So I guess the last question here I have for you, and I'm sure as this conversation gets I feel like there's a lot more to talk about, but we have some time limits. Our role as baristas, as people working in businesses, so not owners, but people who are, baristas, managers, whoever. How do we conduct ourselves and prepare ourselves to function as employees of imperfect businesses? And there's often work that's expected of us that's discordant with our own values. As I hope a lot of operators are listening to this and getting some thoughts going about their own businesses, I want to know maybe how can baristas operate in an imperfect world without moral injury or avoiding it as best they can?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really difficult. I think a lot of people really are making the decision between having an income that can afford them to have a family. And so then they're in jobs that sort of ask this of them. I think a big chunk of this is a lot of sort of my generation of coffee. And I think it kind of existed before as well, but this sort of coffee people generation where you grew up in the industry and you were like, your friends were in coffee, you went to cuppings, you were like living this coffee identity. I think it's sort of just being careful with that and being careful that this isn't the only thing you have, that you have more pillars to be able to stand on. It's that idea of like, you need a couple legs to your chair. Because if one collapses, you're going to need the other ones to stay up. And I think one of the things that the industry needs to be a little bit better at is not putting pressure on people that they have to live this perfect coffee person idea to be able to excel in the industry, but instead start looking at people who have multiple interests, who are doing other things, who are passionate about other stuff. And so if you're in a position of power in a company, it's sort of like moving that culture away from the sort of, say, coffee bro idea and starting to move it away to like, okay, like we gotta dial this down a little bit. Like let's find people from other backgrounds, other worldviews, other ideas, so they can enter this, like make sure there's better representation in positions of leadership. And so I think that how you build against this challenge is actually to build a bigger world for yourself, and then build a bigger world for coffee to live in, that it isn't so insular and that it can kind of look outwards.
Yeah. And if you're somebody who is going to have to work for a business, I mean, it sounds sad to say, but you kind of can't expect that they're going to keep 100% of what they say as a promise, entering in, like going in and saying, well, they say all this stuff on the job description or in their marketing copy, and I, as a prospective barista, believe every single bit of it. It seems like at this point we should expect that there's going to be incongruity, and that's maybe a way to protect ourselves against it. Like, I expect that there's going to be some marketing that's done just to make it polished, and not that it's actually what's going to happen. And maybe that would help me not be morally injured in the course of my career as much.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to flag up one of the things that when we start talking like this is that if we're saying employees shouldn't trust businesses, then I think also businesses have to be realistic and it doesn't work both ways. Like, you can't lie to somebody and then expect them not to lie to you back. Mm-hmm. And you can't treat someone badly and then expect them not to do it back to you. And so I would kind of the word of caution here is that the more you do that, the more you invite it upon yourself, because you're changing the relationship from one of good faith to a one where people are just trying to get whatever they can out of you. And so with this idea of take it with a grain of salt, it's like also I would say be careful with that businesses, because if you want to keep leaning on the idea of hey, it's just marketing, no one believes it. The other thing is hey, they're gonna try to get anything they can out of you, because that's what you've clearly made the relationship about, and you've communicated that and you've cemented it, and so they're gonna start treating you like you treat them.
That's a really good point. And I like the phrase operating in good faith. I think as a relationship, all of us together working in the coffee shop, managers, owners, baristas alike, that mutuality, that good faith is really what makes it work. And if we have this charitable assumption going both ways, I think that we can make a lot of progress as we kind of step forward imperfectly, because maybe people listening to this are like, I've been doing that and I need to make a difference, but it's not going to happen right away. If you're already in it and you've already done some of this stuff and not followed through with your values, then you have some walking back to do, not of your values, but of the things that got in the way in the first place. But operating in good faith, everybody together, seems like that's going to at least have grace enough to cover the imperfections as we move to something better.
In terms of the healing thing, like that is kind of one of those things that, companies sort of do need to maybe get better at understanding, that it's like being in a relationship with any relationship, right? Like you also have to, when something bad's happened, you have to sort of heal it, or you have to like move past it, and sort of constantly ignoring everything. And then it's creating an atmosphere of like everyone hates the workplace, and the workplace represents conflict. It's just going to like become such a distraction from being able to do the job. It just becomes what people talk about, becomes what people do. And it's just like the worst thing I think you can do for your business, because no one talks about how to make the business successful. All people talk about is how miserable they are and how much they don't like it. So learning to heal that and coming being like, okay, being realistic of like, I'm going to listen to my employees, like, what are they unhappy about? And then making it better is something you really got to do. Otherwise, like that idea of like you're the owner constantly trying to make sure you don't go under, you'll make that job a lot easier because you won't be distracted by the conflict, because you've like worked on actually like making it better.
Sure. Yeah. And back to the idea of good faith, I think when you go to your employees and you say, you want to listen to them, you can't act on every single thing that employees say. I mean, not because the business does have limitations, and sometimes baristas and employees have unrealistic expectations of their own, the way that owners do. They enter in, an owner might say, this is my unsustainable business model that I want to run. But then if somebody who's an employee enters into a business and they say, well, I want the business to do all of these things, maybe that are extra beyond what the business actually said that they could do, and now they're really upset about it. So there's some limits that are here, but it shouldn't make people not have those conversations. So like not discounting the fact that people have legitimate complaints or legitimate feedback, just feedback about how things can be made better. So just because you think somebody might have something that you either don't agree with, is unreasonable or not realistic, doesn't mean you shouldn't do those things.
I do think often this this sort of archetype of the rising idea of this, like, the barista expects perfection from the business thing. The baristas have too high of an expectation sometimes of what a coffee business is like. I do think that's smaller than it just doesn't operate and have as much power as business owners having that sort of expectation and conflict, because just by the fact that business owners can fire an employee can take away their livelihood, right? Like an employee typically doesn't leave a job unless they have got a livelihood secured otherwise. Well, an employer can just withdraw that. And so I don't think it's like in the day-to-day workings of it, it's like an equal thing that usually happens. I think what it is like sometimes the employees might have these values, which are, their values. But usually the conflict kind of drives out of this idea of the person who controls if you can pay your rent, or, if you have a house or a mortgage, is they're more in the position of power. And so the conflict would generally be driven by what they're pushing to happen, because they're the one, they made the business, they pushed the business to existence. And so I do think that, like, also being conscious of the power dynamic and how much power you have when you can withdraw someone's livelihood, and how real that is, and how disturbing that can be, and how that's a real feeling that people feel like, oh, I don't want to piss off my boss. They can like fire me, and then I don't know what I'm going to do. That's a real power. And so it isn't kind of like entering from positions of equality. You're entering from positions where like some person can really make some damage.
Yeah, 100%. Your power is something we've said on the show before. Your power is not for you. It's a conduit. You're a conduit for power to distribute power to others in the business. That's the role of leadership. It's a serving position, and not a position to be served. And so, hopefully, if people have been listening to this show long enough, they've heard it enough that they've taken it to heart. The idea that you can fire somebody, especially with one decision. Like, somebody might make a really bad decision about your business, and you think, "Oh my gosh, that's really going to hurt my business," and maybe it does. But there'd have to be a lot of people making bad decisions for a long time to really sink your business. But you could sink somebody really quickly by just a flippant decision about firing them for maybe a reason that's not justified. So you're right. The onus is on owners, especially because of that power, and really solely because of that, in the influence that they have in the business. And so I hope that throughout this conversation, owners have really taken notes, taken things to heart, and I really appreciate you jumping on this call and being on the show. It's really fun, and this is one of those times where I feel like, gosh, we're at like an hour and 20 minutes, probably can go longer, but we'll spare everybody. How can we stay in touch with you? And I know you have a blog where you write about such things. Where can we find that?
Yeah, so I've just kind of recently started more talking, I suppose, in coffee, more outwardly. And I just do that at joshtarlo.com, and then sort of do these, where you found this moral injury thing, more kind of quick explainers on my Instagram at josh.tarlo. Just, trying to be more open about all these years in the industry and sort of the observations that come with it.
Well, I really appreciate your thoughts and what you're doing in coffee. Thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much.
All right, everybody. Well, I hope that was a interesting episode for you. I hope that it was helpful and caused you to kind of question your own motives and how you are following through on the kinds of values that you say you have in your business. Listeners to Keys to the Shop will recognize that this is the type of stuff we talk about often, and on a grand scale, it makes a huge difference on the health of specialty coffee worldwide if we just had more continuity between stated values and actions that actually happen in the businesses that we run. The world would be a better place for sure, and we'd probably make more progress as a result. So lots of thoughts in this conversation, stuff that, of course, we didn't solve all these issues here as we talked about it, but I think it's something we all need to take personally to go into our different spheres of influence and ecosystems and make the necessary changes to get closer to solving it as we go. So a huge thank you to Josh Tarlo for joining me on the show and talking about this very important subject. Again, you can check out more of what Josh has to say and what he's up to over at joshtarlo.com. Now, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback for me about this episode or any other episode of Keys to the Shop, feel free to email me, chris@keystotheshop.com. That's also where you can inquire about Keys to the Shop consulting, chris@keystotheshop.com. So I have a question for you. Have you heard of Coffee Fest? Well, if you've been a listener to the show, of course, you'd be like, well, yeah, Chris, because you are talking about it on these Tuesday episodes. And, I think that you might have heard about Coffee Fest also just in the industry, because in my opinion, it is the best place to go to get inspired, to get resources, and to get tools to thrive as a coffee shop professional. Coffee Fest trade shows have been going on for 30 years. That is 30 years of offering accessible top-level lectures, workshops, trainings, access to amazing vendors on the trade show floor, coffee community and networking, as well as competitions. We're going to New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Seattle next year. I'm going to be at those shows judging latte art, speaking, and I really hope to see you there. Check them out over at coffeefest.com. See what's on offer. You can also go to Coffee Fest 365 for their new online learning platform as well. But to get registered and find out what Coffee Fest is all about, get you and your team equipped for success, go to coffeefest.com. And with that is the end of our show today, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me. I really appreciate all of you. Let's keep working on closing that values action gap in our businesses as we've been inspired to do so today in our conversation with Josh Tarlo. Have an awesome day. And as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.